A 7-year-old boy disappeared without a trace from a local playground, while his father was distracted by a phone call just a few feet away. The community searched tirelessly for months, but as years passed, hope faded, and the case went cold. 12 years later, construction workers breaking ground for a new community center made a discovery that left them shaking and immediately calling the police. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Westridge Elementary School as the final bell rang, releasing a flood of children into the warm May air. Among them was Daniel Torres, a third-grade teacher gathering his belongings as the last of his students filed out of the classroom. At 34, Daniel had been teaching at Westridge for nearly a decade, his patient demeanor and genuine interest in his students making him a favorite among both children and parents. He checked his watch, noting he had just enough time to grade a few papers before heading to his weekly counseling session. The sessions had become an essential part of his routine over the past 12 years, helping him navigate the overwhelming grief and guilt that had nearly destroyed him. Some wounds, he had learned, never fully heal. They simply become manageable. Still here, Mr. Torres? The school's principal, Elaine Harper, stood in the doorway, her expression warm but concerned. "Just finishing up," Daniel replied, gesturing to the stack of math quizzes on his desk. "I promised the kids I'd have these back tomorrow." Elaine studied him for a moment. "The anniversary is coming up next week. Are you sure you don't want to take some time off?" Daniel shook his head. "I'm better when I'm working. You know that." "Well, the offer stands." She hesitated before adding, "By the way, there's a new detective assigned to the cold case unit, Detective Ramona Walsh. She called this morning asking if she could set up a meeting with you." Daniel's hand froze midway through gathering his papers. "After all this time? Why?" "She didn't say, just that she's reviewing all the department's unsolved cases and wants to speak with the key witnesses again." Elaine's voice softened. "You don't have to, if you're not up for it." "No, it's fine." Daniel took a deep breath. It's just been a while since anyone from the police wanted to talk about it. After Elaine left, Daniel sat motionless at his desk, memories washing over him like a physical force. 12 years had passed since that day at Mercer Park, yet he could recall every detail with excruciating clarity. The sound of children laughing, the cool metal of the bench against his palm, the moment he realized his son was gone. His phone buzzed with a text message from his therapist, Dr. Lisa Myers. "See you at 5:30? We should talk about the upcoming date." Daniel responded with a quick affirmative before gathering his things and heading out to his car. The drive to Dr. Myers' office was familiar, the same route he'd been taking every Wednesday for years. As he navigated through Pinewood Springs, modest downtown, his eyes drifted, as they always did, to the various missing child posters that still dotted some of the storefronts. Most had been taken down years ago, but a few loyal business owners kept them up, faded and weather-worn though they were. James Torres, age 7, had been missing since May 17, 2013. A gap-toothed smile, dark curly hair, eyes that sparkled with mischief. "Have you seen this child?" the poster asked. The question had haunted Pinewood Springs for over a decade. Dr. Myers' office was located in a converted Victorian house on Oak Street, the interior transformed into a warm, inviting space designed to put clients at ease. Daniel had spent countless hours in the second-floor corner room, unpacking his grief, rage, and guilt under Dr. Myers' compassionate guidance. "You seem distracted today," Dr. Myers observed after they'd settled into their usual positions. Daniel on the comfortable gray couch, she in the armchair by the window. "The police want to talk to me again," Daniel replied. "A new detective is reviewing the case." "How do you feel about that?" Daniel considered the question. Confused, mostly. What could they possibly hope to find after all this time? They interviewed me at least 20 times in the weeks after it happened. They had me walk through that day over and over until I felt like I was losing my mind. "It's standard procedure when new eyes take over a cold case," Dr. Myers said. They often want to revisit statements, see if anything was missed. Nothing was missed, Daniel said, his voice tight. I told them everything. I was on a bench maybe 15 feet from the playground equipment. James was on the swings. My phone rang. It was the school, about a parent-teacher conference that needed rescheduling. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When I looked up, he was gone. Dr. Myers nodded, familiar with the account Daniel had recounted countless times in their sessions. And you're still certain he wouldn't have wandered off on his own? James knew the rules. He knew not to go anywhere without telling me. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Someone took him. Someone watched us, waited for me to be distracted, and took my son. The session continued with Dr. Myers guiding Daniel through breathing exercises to manage the anxiety that still spiked whenever he discussed the details of that day. By the end of their hour, he felt steadier, though the prospect of meeting with a new detective still weighed heavily on his mind. Call me if you need to talk after you meet with her, Dr. Myers said as they wrapped up. And Daniel, try to remember that this detective's interest doesn't necessarily mean new evidence, just a fresh perspective. Daniel nodded, though a small, persistent part of him couldn't help but hope. Hope was dangerous. He'd learned that lesson through years of false leads and crushed expectations. But it was also impossible to extinguish completely. As he drove home to his modest one-bedroom apartment, Daniel's thoughts drifted to Maria, his ex-wife. They'd tried to weather the storm of their son's disappearance together, but grief had carved different paths for each of them. Maria had needed to move away, to start fresh in another state where not every street corner held memories of James. Daniel had needed to stay, unwilling to abandon the place where his son had last been seen. The divorce had been finalized 4 years after James vanished. They still spoke occasionally, terse, painful conversations that inevitably circled back to the same unanswerable questions. Had they failed their son? Was there something they could have done differently? Would they ever know what happened? Daniel's apartment was small but tidy, the walls covered with his own artwork, landscapes mostly, scenes of peaceful natural, settings that offered a mental escape when memories became too overwhelming. He'd taken up painting at Dr. Myers's suggestion, finding unexpected solace in the meditative process of bringing images to life on canvas. One wall, however, was devoted to James. Photos from every stage of his short life. Drawings he'd made in kindergarten and first grade. A map of Pinewood Springs with Mercer Park at its center, concentric circles radiating outward to indicate search areas. Newspaper clippings from the weeks following his disappearance. Daniel had kept everything, unable to pack away any reminder of his son. Maria had called it unhealthy, his reluctance to move forward. Perhaps she was right, but moving forward felt too much like leaving James behind. His phone rang just as he was heating up leftover pasta for dinner. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. Mr. Torres, this is Detective Ramona Walsh with the Pinewood Springs Police Department. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional. I'm calling about the James Torres case. Yes, Principal Harper mentioned you'd be in touch, Daniel replied, his heart rate quickening despite his effort to remain calm. I'd like to meet with you to go over some details of the case if you're willing. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you? Say 4 o'clock at the station? That's fine. But can I ask why you're reopening the investigation now? Has something new come up? There was a slight pause before Detective Walsh answered. I wouldn't say we're reopening the investigation, Mr. Torres. It was never closed. I'm simply reviewing all the department's cold cases, starting with the most recent ones. It's standard procedure when a new detective takes over the unit. Daniel recognized the diplomatic non-answer. I understand. I'll see you tomorrow at 4. After hanging up, Daniel abandoned any pretense of eating dinner. His appetite had vanished, replaced by a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He made his way to the wall of memories instead, eyes landing on his favorite photo of James. Taken just 2 weeks before he disappeared. showing him proudly holding up a model volcano he'd made for the school science fair. "Where are you, buddy?" Daniel whispered, the question that had haunted him for 12 years hanging in the air unanswered. The following day dragged by with excruciating slowness. Daniel went through the motions of teaching, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of May 17, 2013, as he had countless times before. His students, perceptive as children often are, seemed to sense his distraction and were unusually well behaved. When the final bell rang, Daniel gathered his things quickly, stopping by Elaine's office to let her know he was leaving early for his meeting with Detective Walsh. "Call me after, if you want to talk," Elaine offered. She had been the school counselor when James disappeared, before becoming principal 3 years later. She was one of the few people who truly understood the depth of Daniel's loss, having helped him navigate returning to work in those first impossible months. The Pinewood Springs Police Department was housed in a squat brick building downtown, its interior a maze of desks and filing cabinets that looked largely unchanged since Daniel's last visit years ago. The front desk officer directed him to a small conference room where Detective Walsh was waiting. Daniel had expected someone older, hardened by years on the force. Instead, Ramona Walsh appeared to be in her mid-30s with short, dark hair and alert eyes that studied him carefully as he entered the room. "Mr. Torres, thank you for coming in." She stood to shake his hand. "Please, have a seat." Daniel sat across from her, noting the thick file folder on the table between them. 12 years of investigation condensed into paper and photographs. "I've been reviewing your son's case for the past week," Detective Walsh began, her tone professional but not unkind. "I have to say the initial investigation was thorough. Detective Sorensen did everything by the book. And yet they found nothing." Daniel couldn't keep the bitterness from his voice. "Sometimes that happens, even in the best investigations." Detective Walsh opened the file, revealing the top page, a school photo of James. "I'd like to go through your statement again if that's all right. Sometimes fresh ears catch things that might have been overlooked." Daniel nodded, steeling himself. "Where would you like me to start?" "Take me through the entire day, beginning with the morning of May 17th. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, summoning the memories he'd revisited so often they felt worn like old photographs. It was a Friday. James was excited because his class was having a pizza party that afternoon to celebrate finishing their state testing. I dropped him off at school at the usual time, around 7:45. He had on his favorite blue t-shirt with a rocket ship on it and jeans, new sneakers, red ones we'd bought the weekend before. He paused, remembering how James had insisted on wearing those sneakers every day that week, proudly showing them off to his friends. The school day was normal. I picked him up at 3:15. He wanted to go to Mercer Park before heading home, which was our usual Friday routine when the weather was nice. "And what time did you arrive at the park?" Detective Walsh asked, making notes. "Around 3:30. It wasn't very crowded, maybe a half dozen other kids with parents. James headed straight for the swings. They were his favorite. I sat on a bench nearby, close enough to watch him." "And you had clear visibility of the playground from where you were sitting?" Daniel nodded. "Complete visibility. The only time I looked away was when my phone rang at about 3:45. It was the school secretary calling to reschedule a parent-teacher conference. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When I looked up, James was gone." "What did you do next?" "I called his name, thinking maybe he'd gone to the slide or the climbing structure. When he didn't answer, I searched the entire playground area. Then I started asking the other parents if they'd seen him. No one had noticed anything unusual." Daniel's hands clenched involuntarily as he continued. "I called 911 at 3:53 p.m. The first officers arrived by 4:05. By 4:30, they had organized a search of the entire park and surrounding neighborhoods. By nightfall, there were over 100 people looking for him." Detective Walsh nodded, her expression revealing nothing. "In your original statement, You mentioned seeing a man watching the playground earlier that afternoon. Can you tell me more about that? Daniel frowned. I'm not sure watching is the right word. He was sitting on a bench on the opposite side of the playground. Middle-aged, baseball cap, sunglasses. Nothing particularly unusual about him. The only reason I noticed him at all was because he was alone. No kids with him. Would you recognize him if you saw him again? Daniel shook his head. I couldn't even give a decent description back then. He was too far away, and I only glanced at him once or twice. Detective Walsh made another note before continuing. Let's talk about your relationship with your ex-wife at the time. You were still married when James disappeared, correct? Yes, though we were having some problems. Nothing serious, just the usual stresses, work, finances. Daniel's throat tightened. After James, we tried to stay together, but it was too painful. We finalized the divorce in 2017. And where is Ms. Torres now? Maria lives in Colorado. She remarried a few years ago. Do you still speak with her? Occasionally. Birthdays, holidays, the anniversary? Daniel met the detective's gaze directly. If you're wondering if Maria had anything to do with James's disappearance, the answer is absolutely not. She was at work that day. Dozens of people saw her, and she loved our son more than anything. Detective Walsh held up a hand. I have to ask these questions, Mr. Torres. It's my job to consider every possibility, no matter how unlikely. They continued for another hour, Detective Walsh methodically working through the details of that day and the weeks that followed. She asked about James's friends, his teachers, any unusual incidents in the months before his disappearance. Much of it was ground that had been covered extensively in the original investigation. Is there anything else you can tell me? She asked finally. Anything that might have seemed insignificant at the time but has stayed with you? Daniel hesitated. There is one thing. It's probably nothing. I told Detective Sorensen about it years ago, and he said it was most likely a coincidence. Detective Walsh leaned forward slightly. I'd like to hear it anyway. About 2 weeks before James disappeared, I noticed a car parked across from the school during pickup. A dark sedan, older model. I noticed it because it was in the same spot. 3 days in a row, but no one ever got out of it. The windows were tinted, so I couldn't see who was inside. Did you get a license plate number? Daniel shook his head. No. Like I said, I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just odd. Detective Walsh made one final note before closing the file. Thank you for your time, Mr. Torres. I know how difficult this must be for you. Are you going to interview other witnesses again? The parents who were at the park that day? Yes, I'll be speaking with everyone who gave statements in the original investigation. She hesitated, then added, I should tell you that I'm also planning to have cadaver dogs search certain areas that weren't fully covered in the initial investigation. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Cadaver dogs. Searching for a body. His son's body. Despite 12 years of uncertainty, a part of him had never fully accepted the possibility that James might be dead. You think he's not alive? Daniel said, his voice barely audible. Detective Walsh's expression softened slightly. I don't know what happened to your son, Mr. Torres. But as a detective, I have to consider all possibilities. The sad reality is that in cases where a child has been missing this long, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I understand, Daniel said, rising from his chair. He felt suddenly exhausted, the weight of 12 years of grief and uncertainty crushing down on him. If there's anything else you need from me, I'll be in touch, Detective Walsh assured him. And Mr. Torres, I know every detective says this, but I promise you I'm going to do everything I can to find out what happened to James. Daniel nodded, unable to formulate a response. He'd heard similar promises many times before. As he left the police station and stepped into the late afternoon sunshine, He couldn't decide what was worse: the thought that James might be dead, or the slim, torturous hope that he might still be alive somewhere, wondering why his father had never found him. Detective Ramona Walsh sat alone in her office long after her meeting with Daniel Torres had ended, the case file spread open before her. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting harsh shadows across the 12 years of investigative dead ends. She'd been with the Pinewood Springs Police Department for just 6 months, having transferred from Portland where she'd specialized in crimes against children. Cold cases were her expertise, though expertise felt like the wrong word. How could anyone claim mastery over such profound failures of justice? She studied the photographs from the original investigation, Mercer Park from various angles, the playground equipment, aerial views of the search grid, the missing child poster showing James Torres's gap-toothed smile. Then there were the suspects, a collection of local sex offenders, transients spotted in the area, and even a few park employees who'd been working that day. All had been questioned extensively. All had alibis or were eventually cleared through. Lack of evidence. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Chief Bradley Hoffman stood in the doorway, his imposing frame filling the space. At 58, with 3 decades on the force, Hoffman had been a junior detective when James Torres disappeared. The case had clearly left its mark on him. "How did it go with the father?" he asked, stepping into the small office. Ramona sighed. "About as expected. He's still deeply traumatized, still hoping for answers, and still convinced his son was abducted. What's your read so far?" "Honestly, I think the original investigation was solid." Ramona gestured to the thick file. "Sorensen did everything right. Immediate response, thorough search, careful interviews, widespread media coverage. If there was evidence to be found, they would have found it." Chief Hoffman nodded slowly. "So why review it now?" "Because sometimes distance gives perspective. And because—" She hesitated, unsure how to articulate her reason for selecting this particular case for review. "Because it's personal for you," Hoffman finished for her, his tone neutral rather than accusatory. Ramona met his gaze steadily. "Every missing child case is personal, Chief." "Yes, but not every missing child case has parallels to your own history." Ramona had known this conversation would come eventually. Her background wasn't a secret. It had been discussed during her hiring process. Still, she'd hoped to establish herself in the department before her past became a topic of discussion. "I was 12 when my brother disappeared," she said evenly. "Different circumstances, different outcome. I don't think it compromises my objectivity." "I'm not suggesting it does," Chief Hoffman said, his expression softening. "Sometimes personal connection gives us insight others might miss. Just be careful. This case broke Sorensen. It's part of why he took early retirement, and it nearly destroyed Torres." "I'll be careful," Ramona promised. "Right now, I'm just reviewing what was done, looking for any stones that might have been left unturned." After Chief Hoffman left, Ramona turned back to the file. She spent another hour reviewing witness statements from that day in May 12 years ago. Parents described a normal afternoon at the park. No one had seen James leave or being led away. No one had noticed any suspicious individuals beyond the man Daniel Torres had mentioned, the one sitting alone wearing a cap and sunglasses. That man had never been identified. Ramona leaned back in her chair, considering the most likely scenarios. Stranger abductions were exceedingly rare, but they did happen. More commonly, children were taken by someone they knew, a non-custodial parent, a relative, a family friend. But Maria Torres had a solid alibi, and there were no other obvious suspects among the family's acquaintances. The third possibility, that James had wandered off on his own and met with an accident, had been the focus of much of the original search. Mercer Park bordered a wooded area with a small creek running through it. The creek had been thoroughly searched, as had the woods. No trace of James had been found. Ramona closed the file, coming to a decision. Tomorrow she would visit the park, herself, walk the scene, and try to see it through fresh eyes. Then she'd contact Maria Torres in Colorado. The ex-wife's perspective might offer insights that had been overlooked. Morning brought clear skies and mild temperatures as Ramona drove to Mercer Park. The playground had been renovated in the years since James's disappearance, with new equipment, replacing the structures shown in the case file photographs. She parked and made her way to the bench where Daniel Torres had been sitting that fateful day. From this vantage point, she could see the entire playground area. It would have been nearly impossible for someone to approach from the front and take a child without being noticed. The back of the playground, however, bordered the wooded area. There, it might have been possible for an abductor to lure a child away from the play equipment and into the trees unobserved. Ramona walked the perimeter of the playground, then followed the path into the wooded area. The creek was shallow, easily crossed by an adult or older child. Beyond the woods lay a residential neighborhood, another possible escape route. As she retraced her steps to the playground, Ramona's phone rang. It was Officer Jensen from Dispatch. Detective Walsh? You're going to want to get over to the community center construction site on Maple Drive. The foreman just called in. They found something while excavating for the foundation. What kind of something? Ramona asked, already heading toward her car. Human remains, Jensen replied grimly. Small ones, possibly a child. Ramona's heart rate quickened. I'm on my way. Have them secure the scene and call in the medical examiner. The community center site was a hive of activity when Ramona arrived. Patrol officers had established a perimeter around the partially excavated foundation, and crime scene technicians were already setting up equipment. The construction foreman, a stocky man named Mike Reeves, approached as she ducked under the yellow tape. Detective Walsh, I'm the one who called it in. Ramona nodded. Can you show me exactly where the remains were found? Reeves led her to the northeast corner of the excavation. We were digging the foundation trench with the backhoe when Daryl noticed something in the bucket. At first, we thought it was just trash. This area used to be an informal dump site years ago before the city acquired the property. But then we saw what looked like, well, bones. Ramona peered down into the excavation. A tarp had been placed over the area where the remains had been exposed. 2 crime scene technicians were carefully photographing the scene before disturbing. Anything further? Has this area been searched before? She asked, thinking about the massive effort to find James Torres 12 years earlier. Not that I know of, Reeves replied. This land was privately owned until about 5 years ago when the city purchased it for development. It was pretty overgrown back then, lots of brambles and such. Not the kind of place people would normally go looking around. Ramona thanked him and made her way carefully down into the excavation to speak with the lead CSI, a veteran technician named Sarah Wong. What have we got, Sarah? Wong lifted the edge of the tarp. Partial skeletal remains. Definitely human. Definitely a child based on the size. The backhoe damaged some of the bones, but there's enough intact to work with. I'm seeing what appears to be a complete skull and most of a rib cage. No sign of clothing or personal effects yet, but we're just getting started. How long have they been here, ballpark? Wong shook her head. Can't say for sure until Dr. Mehta examines them, but based on the level of decomposition and soil integration, I'd say a minimum of 5 years, possibly much longer. Ramona's mind immediately went to James Torres. The timing would fit. But there had been other missing children cases in the region over the years. She couldn't allow herself to jump to conclusions. Let me know as soon as Dr. Mehta arrives, she said, and I want every inch of this site processed. If there's anything else buried here, clothing, toys, a backpack, I want it found. As the afternoon wore on, the careful excavation of the remains continued. Dr. Kavita Mehta, the county medical examiner, arrived and conducted a preliminary examination at the scene before the remains were removed for transport to the morgue. Male. Child, approximately 6 to 8 years old, she reported to Ramona. No obvious cause of death visible from the skeletal remains, though there's what appears to be blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Could be peri-mortem or post-mortem. I'll know more after a thorough examination. How long has the, body been here? Ramona asked. Based on soil conditions and decomposition, I'd estimate 8 to 15 years, Dr. Mehta replied. The body was buried approximately 4 feet deep originally. It appears to have been a hasty burial. No coffin or container, just the body placed directly in the soil. 8 to 15 years. The time frame encompassed James Torres's disappearance. Ramona felt a cold certainty settling in her stomach, though she kept her expression neutral. How soon can you have an identification? She asked. Dental records comparison could be relatively quick if we have a likely match to compare to, Dr. Mehta said. DNA would take longer, especially if the remains are degraded. Do you have a specific case in mind? Ramona nodded. James Torres, missing since May 2013. 7 years old at the time. Dr. Mehta made a note. I'll request his dental records from the original case file. If it's him, we should be able to confirm fairly quickly. As the remains were carefully packaged and removed from the scene, Ramona called Chief Hoffman to update him on the discovery. I'm not jumping to conclusions, she said, but the age range and time frame match James Torres. Let's wait for confirmation before we contact the parents, Chief Hoffman advised. No sense putting them through that emotional ringer if it turns out to be another case. Agreed. But we should probably give the construction company a heads up. That work might be delayed. We'll need to expand the search area to make sure there's nothing else buried there. After hanging up, Ramona supervised the widening search of the construction site. Crime scene technicians carefully sifted through the soil removed by the backhoe, while others used ground-penetrating radar to check for additional disturbances in the surrounding area. By early evening, they had recovered several additional items from the vicinity of the remains: fabric scraps that might have been clothing, what appeared to be the remnants of a child's sneaker, and most significantly, a small metal toy car, tarnished but still recognizable as a miniature red fire engine. Ramona examined the toy car carefully. It could mean nothing, just random trash discarded in what had once been an unofficial dump site. Or it could be a crucial piece of evidence. She bagged it personally, making sure it was properly tagged for the evidence locker. As the search wound down for the day, Ramona drove back to the station, her mind racing with possibilities. If the remains were those of James Torres, what did that mean for the case? Had he been abducted from the park by someone who then killed him and buried his body here? Or had he wandered off, encountered someone at this location, and been killed to silence him? Or was there some other explanation entirely? The station was quiet when she arrived, most of the day shift having already gone home. Ramona headed straight for the evidence room to log in the items she'd brought from the scene, then returned to her office where the Torres case file still lay open on her desk. She pulled out the missing person report and examined it closely. James Torres had last been seen wearing a blue t-shirt with a rocket ship design, jeans, and new red sneakers. The partial shoe recovered at the scene had been too degraded to determine its color. More tellingly, the inventory of James's personal belongings mentioned that he'd been carrying a small backpack that day, containing his favorite toys, including a collection of die-cast metal vehicles. Among them, according to Maria Torres's statement, a red fire engine that James had received as a birthday present the month before. Ramona leaned back in her chair, a heavy certainty settling over her. The dental records would confirm it, she was sure, but she already knew. They had found James Torres. After 12 years, the little boy who had vanished from the playground while his father was momentarily distracted had finally been found. The question now was how he had gotten from Mercer Park to what was then an undeveloped lot nearly a mile away, and, more importantly, who had put him there. She looked again at the list of suspects from the original investigation. Most had been cleared convincingly, but one name caught her attention: Edward Pullman, a maintenance worker who had been employed by the City Parks Department at the time of James's disappearance. Pullman had been questioned and released. His alibi, that he had been working at a different park across town that day, had been corroborated by his supervisor. But something about his file nagged at Ramona. Pullman had left Pinewood Springs abruptly just 2 months after James disappeared, supposedly to care for an ailing mother in Arizona. The original investigators had followed up with him there, but the case notes indicated he'd been cooperative, and there had been no evidence connecting him to the disappearance. Ramona made a note to look deeper into Pullman's background. Tomorrow, she would request his employment records from the Parks Department and see if there was anything that might connect him to the area where James's remains had been found. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Dr. Mehta. Detective Walsh? I've completed a preliminary examination of the remains and compared the dental records. I can confirm that they belong to James Torres. Though Ramona had been expecting this, the confirmation still hit her hard. Cause of death? Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, Dr. Mehta replied. A single powerful blow that would have been fatal almost instantly. There are also fractures to the right radius and ulna, defensive wounds most likely. He tried to protect himself. Ramona closed her eyes briefly, imagining the terrified 7-year-old's final moments. Thank you, doctor. I'll be by in the morning to see the full report. After hanging up, Ramona sat in silence for several minutes, processing what this meant for the investigation. A missing persons case had just become a homicide, and somewhere out there was a killer who had evaded justice for 12 years. The most difficult part of her job now lay ahead, telling Daniel Torres that his son had been found, but not in the way he had desperately hoped for all these years, that the uncertainty was over, replaced by a grim certainty that might be even harder to bear. The early morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Ramona arrived at Daniel Torres's apartment complex. She deliberated over the timing, wondering if it would be kinder to wait until later in the day. But news of skeletal remains found at a construction site was already spreading through Pinewood Springs. Local reporters were gathering at the scene, and it would be only a matter of time before speculation about James Torres began. Daniel deserved to hear the truth from her, not from a news bulletin or a well-meaning neighbor's phone call. She parked her unmarked sedan and checked her appearance in the rearview mirror. The sleepless night showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. How many of these notifications had she made over the years? Dozens, at least. It never got easier, especially in cases like this where hope had somehow survived for so long against impossible odds. Daniel answered her knock almost immediately, suggesting he hadn't slept much either. He was fully dressed despite the early hour, his hair damp from a recent shower. The moment he saw her standing there, his expression shifted from surprise to a resigned understanding. "You found something," he said, his voice flat. Not a question, but a statement. "May I come in?" Ramona asked gently. Daniel stepped back wordlessly, gesturing for her to enter. The apartment was neat but sparse, the walls covered with paintings, landscapes that contrasted sharply with the wall of memories dedicated to James that she'd noticed during her first visit. "I should offer you coffee," Daniel said absently. "But I think I'd rather you just tell me." Ramona nodded. She'd never believed in prolonging these moments with empty pleasantries. Yesterday afternoon, construction workers breaking ground for the new community center on Maple Drive discovered human remains. The medical examiner has confirmed through dental records that they are James's remains. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. His eyes remained fixed on her face, as if waiting for her to continue, to offer some explanation that might make sense of the words she'd just spoken. "I'm so sorry," Ramona added, the inadequacy of the phrase bitter on her tongue. Daniel finally broke his silence. "How did he die?" The medical examiner found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. "It would have been quick. Was he..." Daniel swallowed hard. Was he there all this time? Just a mile from where he disappeared? It appears so. The area was undeveloped when James went missing, overgrown, used as an informal dumping ground. It wasn't searched thoroughly during the initial investigation. Daniel's composure began to crack. He sank into a chair, his shoulders hunching forward. 12 years, he whispered. 12 years of wondering, hoping he might be alive somewhere. And all this time, he was buried in the dirt less than a mile away. Ramona remained standing, giving him space to process. In her experience, this moment, the confirmation of death after a long disappearance, often brought a complex mixture of grief, rage, and paradoxically, a kind of relief. The torture of not knowing was over, even if what replaced it was painful certainty. "What happens now?" Daniel asked after several minutes of silence. "The investigation has been reclassified as a homicide," Ramona explained. "We're following several leads based on both the original case file and evidence found at the burial site." "What evidence?" "Among other items, we recovered a small metal toy car, a red fire engine. The case file mentioned James had one with him that day." Daniel's head jerked up, his eyes suddenly focused. "He carried it everywhere. It was his favorite." His voice broke on the last word. "We believe it may help establish a timeline of events," Ramona said carefully. "Mr. Torres, I know this is an incredibly difficult time, but I need to ask you a few more questions about the day James disappeared. Details that might not have seemed important then could be crucial now." Daniel nodded, visibly pulling himself together. "Whatever you need." The case file mentions James was carrying a small backpack that day. Can you recall exactly what was in it? His water bottle. The toy cars, there were 5 of them, including the fire engine. A small stuffed dinosaur. And a book. A magic treehouse book, I think. Daniel closed his eyes, reaching for the memory. He'd also put in a plastic container of cookies that Maria had baked the night before. Chocolate chip. "And you're certain he had the backpack with him at the park?" "Positive. I remember telling him to put it on the bench next to me when he went to play on the swings, but he insisted on hanging it on the swing set post. He said he wanted to keep an eye on it." Ramona made a note. The backpack hadn't been found at the burial site, at least not yet. If the killer had taken it, that might explain why the toy car had been buried with James. It could have fallen out during the attack or burial. "I'd like to ask about anyone who might have shown unusual interest in James in the weeks before his disappearance," Ramona continued. "Not just strangers, but people you knew. Teachers, coaches, neighbors, friends of the family." Daniel frowned, considering the question. "There's nothing that stands out. James was well-liked but shy. He didn't interact much with adults outside of family and school." "What about Edward Pullman? He was a maintenance worker for the Parks Department. Do you recall ever meeting him or seeing him around Mercer Park?" "The name doesn't sound familiar, but honestly, I wouldn't have paid much attention to maintenance workers. They were just part of the background." Ramona showed him a photograph from the case file. "This is Pullman, taken during his initial interview 12 years ago." Daniel studied the photo of a nondescript man in his 40s with thinning brown hair and a forgettable face. After a moment, he shook his head. "I don't recognize him. Was he involved?" "We don't know yet. His alibi checked out during the original investigation, but we're taking another look at everyone who was questioned." Ramona put the photo away. "We'll need to notify your ex-wife as well. Would you prefer to call her, or should I?" Daniel seemed to deflate further at the mention of Maria. "I should do it, but not yet. I need some time to process this first." "I understand. We'll hold off on public statements until tomorrow to give you both time, but I should warn you that there's already media interest in the discovery. It might be better if Maria hears it from you rather than the news." Daniel nodded numbly. "I'll call her this afternoon." Ramona stood to leave, placing her card on the coffee table. Please call me if you think of anything else, no matter how insignificant it might seem. And Mr. Torres, I know it may not feel like it right now, but finding James is the first step toward getting justice for him." As she headed back to her car, Ramona noticed several neighbors watching from windows and porches. News traveled fast in small communities like Pinewood Springs. By now, many would have connected the discovery of remains with the Torres case. The whispers would spread throughout the day, reaching fever pitch when official confirmation came. Her next stop was the medical examiner's office, where Dr. Mehta was completing her detailed analysis of James's remains. The sterile examination room was a stark contrast to the emotional intensity of Daniel Torres's apartment. "Ah, Detective Walsh," Dr. Mehta greeted her, looking up from her work. "I've completed the full examination. Nothing significant to add to my preliminary findings. Cause of death was a single forceful blow to the occipital region of the skull, consistent with being struck from behind with a heavy, blunt object." "Any idea what kind of object?" Ramona asked, studying the small skeleton laid out on the examination table. It was hard to reconcile these fragile bones with the vibrant child from the missing person posters. Something with a flat, smooth surface. A shovel would be consistent with the fracture pattern, which might make sense if the killer brought a tool to bury the body. Time of death? Dr. Mehta shook her head. Impossible to determine precisely after so many years. All I can say with confidence is that the remains are consistent with a child who died 15 years ago, which aligns with the timing of James's disappearance. The dental records are definitive. What about the defensive fractures you mentioned? Here, Dr. Mehta pointed to the small bones of the right forearm. These breaks suggest he raised his arm to protect himself, either from the blow that killed him or from earlier strikes that didn't leave marks on the skeleton. Ramona felt a chill at this confirmation that James had seen his attacker, had time to be afraid, to try to defend himself. Was there any evidence of sustained physical abuse prior to death? Healed fractures? Anything like that? None that I can detect. This appears to have been a single violent incident, not a pattern of abuse. This aligned with what Ramona knew about the Torres family. There had never been any reports of domestic violence or child abuse. By all accounts, James had been a happy, well-cared-for child. "I've sent samples for a full toxicology panel," Dr. Mehta continued. "Though with this level of decomposition, I'm not optimistic about finding much. I've also prepared the dental charts and photographs for the official record." "Thank you, Doctor. When will the remains be released to the family?" "They can be released as soon as tomorrow if there are no further forensic tests needed. I assume the family will want to make funeral arrangements promptly." Ramona nodded, thinking of Daniel Torres and the wall of memories in his apartment. After 12 years of uncertainty, he would finally be able to lay his son to rest. It would bring closure of a sort, though she knew from both professional and personal experience that such closure was rarely as healing as people expected. From the medical examiner's office, Ramona drove to the Pinewood Springs Parks Department headquarters. She'd called ahead to request employment records for Edward Pullman, and the department's administrative assistant had them waiting. "These are copies of everything we have," the woman explained, handing over a thin folder. "Most of our records from that time aren't digitized, so this is what we could find in the archives." Ramona thanked her and took the folder to a quiet corner of the building's small lobby. Pullman's employment history showed he'd worked for the Parks Department for just over 2 years before his abrupt resignation in July 2013, 2 months after James's disappearance. His job evaluations were adequate, but unremarkable. The only disciplinary note was for unauthorized use of a department vehicle after hours, about 3 months before James vanished. What caught Ramona's attention was Pullman's work assignment, log. While his alibi for the day of James's disappearance checked out, he had indeed been scheduled to work at Riverside Park across town. The log showed he'd been responsible for maintenance at Mercer Park numerous times in the weeks prior. He would have been a familiar presence there, perhaps even recognizable to regular visitors like James and his father. More intriguingly, Pullman had also been assigned to clear debris from the undeveloped lot on Maple Drive, where James's body had been found just 1 week before the disappearance. The entry noted he'd been provided with a department truck and tools, including shovels, rakes, and refuse containers. Ramona photographed the relevant pages with her phone before returning the folder to the administrative assistant. "Do you know if anyone is still working here who might have supervised Pullman directly?" she asked. "That would be Frank Gillespie. He's still our head of maintenance, going on 20 years now. His office is down the hall, last door on the left." Frank Gillespie was a weathered man in his early 60s with calloused hands and a guarded expression. He eyed Ramona's badge with the wariness of someone who'd dealt with law enforcement before. "Edward Pullman," he repeated after Ramona explained why she was there. "That's a name I haven't heard in years. Quiet guy, kept to himself. Did his job well enough, but never went above and beyond." "You supervised him directly?" Gillespie nodded. "I supervise all the maintenance workers, have since 2010. Do you recall anything unusual about his behavior in the weeks before or after James Torres disappeared?" Gillespie frowned, considering the question. "Can't say that I do, though honestly, I didn't pay that much attention to him specifically. We had about a dozen workers back then, and my job was making sure the park stayed maintained, not micromanaging everyone." The records show Pullman resigned suddenly in July 2013, citing his mother's illness. Did that strike you as odd at the time? "Not really. People come and go in these jobs. The pay isn't great, and a lot of folks find better opportunities elsewhere." Gillespie paused, his brow furrowing. "Though now that you mention it, I do remember being a bit surprised. Pullman had just put in for vacation time the week before, had plans to go fishing at Lake Cascade. Then suddenly he's handing in his resignation and saying he has to move to Arizona right away. But people's circumstances change, you know? Did he ever mention family before that? The mother he supposedly went to care for?" Gillespie shook his head. "Not that I recall. Like I said, he kept to himself. Wasn't one for sharing personal details." "What about his work at the Maple Drive lot?" The records show he was assigned there about a week before James disappeared. "Probably just routine cleanup. That place was always collecting garbage, kids drinking, people dumping trash to avoid the landfill fees. We'd send someone over every few months to clear it out." Gillespie scratched his chin thoughtfully. Come to think of it, Pullman volunteered for that assignment, said he didn't mind the solitary work. Ramona's interest sharpened. "He specifically asked to work that site?" "Yeah, I remember, because it was unusual. Most of the guys hated cleanup detail, especially at that lot. It was isolated, overgrown, full of thorny bushes and poison ivy. But Pullman said he preferred jobs where he could work alone. Did he have access to department vehicles and equipment when he wasn't on duty?" Gillespie shifted uncomfortably. "Officially, no. But there was an incident. He took a truck one weekend without authorization, claimed he needed to move some furniture and forgot to ask permission. I wrote him up for it, but that was the end of it. When exactly was this? February or March 2013, I think. A few months before the Torres kid went missing." Ramona made a note, then showed Gillespie the photograph of Pullman from the case file. "Just to confirm, this is the Edward Pullman you worked with?" Gillespie squinted at the photo. "That's him, all right. Wouldn't stand out in a crowd, would he? That was kind of his thing, blending into the background." After leaving the Parks Department, Ramona called Chief Hoffman to update him on her findings. "It's circumstantial at best," she admitted. But Pullman had opportunity, access to the burial site, familiarity with the park where James disappeared, and timing that lines up suspiciously well with his sudden departure from town. "What about motive?" Hoffman asked. "Any indication he had a history with the Torres family or a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward children?" "Nothing in his record here, but I'm waiting on a background check from Arizona. I've also requested any records from the original investigation related to his interview and alibi verification. According to the case notes, his supervisor confirmed. He was working at Riverside Park when James disappeared, but I want to see if there were any inconsistencies. Good work, Walsh. Keep me posted. The press conference is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 10. We'll need to have our statement prepared. By then, Ramona ended the call and sat in her car, reviewing what she'd learned. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, but significant gaps remained. How had Pullman, if he was the killer, lured James away from the playground without being noticed? What was his motive? And most importantly, where was he now? The background check would tell her if Edward Pullman was still in Arizona, still using that name. But experience had taught her that predators were adept at reinventing themselves, at disappearing into new lives when their old ones became dangerous. As she started her car, Ramona's phone rang again. It was the lab. Detective Walsh? We've completed the initial processing of the items recovered from the burial site. There's something you should know about the shoe fragments. Go ahead, Ramona said, her attention fully focused. We found trace amounts of paint on the rubber sole, red paint, consistent with the type used for road markings and crosswalks. It's degraded, but the chemical signature matches the paint that would have been used by the city around 2013. That could help. Establish a timeline, Ramona mused. If James stepped in wet paint shortly before he died, we might be able to narrow down where he was and when. There's something else. We analyzed soil samples from both inside and around the gravesite. The soil inside the grave contained traces of a commercial herbicide, the kind used by municipal workers to control weeds in parks and public spaces. It appears the killer may have sprinkled it over the grave after burial. To prevent plant growth, Ramona realized, to keep the disturbed earth from looking different from the surrounding area if plants failed to grow there? Exactly. And it's the same herbicide that would have been used by the Parks Department in 2013. The pieces were coming together more clearly now. Someone with knowledge of municipal maintenance practices, someone with access to herbicides and equipment, someone who knew the Maple Drive lot would be a good place to conceal a body because it was rarely visited and already disturbed by illegal dumping. Someone like Edward Pullman. Ramona felt the familiar surge of determination that came with a break in a case. Send me the full report as soon as it's ready, and pull any soil samples from the surrounding area of the Maple Drive lot from the evidence collected yesterday. I want to see if the herbicide was used anywhere else on that property. As she drove back to the station, Ramona's mind was already mapping out next steps. A warrant for Pullman's detailed employment records, interviews with any other Parks Department, employees who had worked with him, and most importantly, locating Pullman himself, the man who, she increasingly believed, had cut short James Torres's life and buried him like trash in an overlooked corner of Pinewood Springs. Ramona stood at the back of the crowded conference room as Chief Hoffman addressed the assembled press. Camera flashes punctuated his solemn announcement that the remains found at the community center construction site had been positively identified as those of James Torres, missing since 2013. The room erupted with questions, but Hoffman maintained control, revealing only the basic facts. James had died from blunt force trauma. The case was now classified as a homicide, and the investigation was active and ongoing. In the front row, Daniel Torres sat rigidly, his expression frozen in grief. Next to him was Maria Torres, who had flown in from Colorado after receiving his call. Despite their estrangement, they presented a united front, their shared loss bridging the chasm that had formed between them. When it was their turn to speak, Maria took the podium first, her voice surprisingly steady as she read from prepared remarks. Our son James was a bright, loving child whose life was cut short by an act of unfathomable cruelty. For 12 years, we have lived in limbo, hoping, against hope, that he might still be alive somewhere. While the confirmation of his death brings us unspeakable pain, it also gives us the chance to properly mourn him and, God willing, to see justice done. Daniel spoke next, his words less polished but no less powerful. "I want to thank Detective Walsh and the Pinewood Springs Police Department for their dedication to finding the truth. We ask that anyone who might have information, no matter how insignificant it might seem, please come forward. Someone took our son from us. Someone robbed him of the chance to grow up, to live his life. That person should not be allowed to walk free while James lies in a grave." After the press conference, Ramona met briefly with the Torres family in a private room away from the media frenzy. "We're pursuing several promising leads," she assured them. "The evidence recovered from the burial site has given us a much clearer picture of what happened to James." "Do you have a suspect?" Maria asked directly, her grief momentarily eclipsed by a fierce need to know. Ramona considered how much to share. Normally, she would be cautious about revealing details of an ongoing investigation to victims' families, but in this case, the Torres family had waited 12 years for answers. They deserved as much transparency as she could offer without compromising the case. "We're looking closely at a former Parks Department employee named Edward Pullman," she explained. "He worked at both Mercer Park and the site where James was found. He left town abruptly a few months after James disappeared." "I don't recognize the name," Maria said, frowning. "He would have been part of the background," Ramona said. "Maintenance workers are often invisible to park visitors, but he would have known the layout, the routines, the quieter areas where a child might be vulnerable." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "Where is he now?" "That's what we're working to determine. The address in Arizona, where he supposedly went to care for his mother, turned out to be false. We're coordinating with agencies in multiple states to track his movements after he left Pinewood Springs." "So he just gets away with it?" Maria's voice rose with indignation. 12 years later, and he's probably living a normal life somewhere while our son is dead? "I promise you," Ramona said with quiet intensity, "if Pullman is responsible for James's death, we will find him and he will face justice. Cases like this don't solve themselves overnight, but every new piece of evidence brings us closer." After the Torres family left to make funeral arrangements, Ramona returned to her office where a stack of reports awaited her attention. The background check on Edward Pullman had come back with concerning red flags. His Arizona address had indeed proven false. The property existed, but had been owned continuously by an elderly couple since 2005. They had never heard of Edward Pullman and had certainly never rented to him. More troublingly, Pullman's employment history prior to Pinewood Springs showed a pattern of jobs in parks, schools, and recreation centers, all places where children gathered. He never stayed in one location for more than 2 to 3 years before moving on, usually after some unspecified incident that didn't quite rise to the level of formal documentation, but raised enough concern that supervisors were relieved to see him go. A knock at her door interrupted Ramona's reading. Officer Jensen stood in the doorway, his expression suggesting he had news. "The lab finished processing the rest of the evidence from the burial site," he reported. "They found partial fingerprints on the red toy car. Badly degraded, but potentially usable. They're running them now." "Good. What about the soil analysis?" "Confirms what they told you yesterday. The herbicide was concentrated in the grave site, but not found in significant amounts elsewhere on the property. Someone definitely used it intentionally to disguise the disturbed earth." Ramona nodded. "And the search of the city's road maintenance records? Found something interesting there," Jensen said, handing her a printout. "The city repainted crosswalks and curbs at several locations during the week James disappeared. One of those locations was just 2 blocks from the Maple Drive lot, on the route between there and Mercer Park. So James could have stepped in wet paint while being led or carried from the park to the burial site," Ramona concluded. "The timeline fits." "There's one more thing," Jensen added. "The paint crew supervisor that week was Frank Gillespie, before he was promoted to head of park maintenance. He's the one who would have assigned the road painting schedule." "The same Frank Gillespie who supervised Edward Pullman," Ramona said, putting the pieces together. I need to talk to him again, immediately. 30 minutes later, Ramona was back at the Parks Department, but Frank Gillespie wasn't in his office. According to his secretary, he'd left shortly after Ramona's visit. The previous day, claiming he felt ill. He hadn't come in today. Did he mention where he was going? Ramona asked. Maybe a doctor's appointment. No, he just grabbed his jacket and left. I tried calling his cell this morning when he didn't show up, but it went straight to voicemail. Ramona's instincts, honed by years of investigative work, were sending up warning flares. I need his home address and any emergency contacts you have on file. The secretary hesitated. I'd need authorization for that? I can get a warrant, Ramona said evenly. Or you can recognize that this is a homicide investigation involving a child victim, and time may be of the essence. The secretary relented, providing Gillespie's address in a quiet subdivision on the outskirts of Pinewood Springs, along with his emergency contact, a sister who lived in Boise. Before heading to Gillespie's home, Ramona called Chief Hoffman to update him and request backup. I think Gillespie knows something about Pullman's involvement in the Torres case, she explained. His sudden disappearance right after I asked about Pullman is too coincidental. You think Gillespie was involved in the murder? Hoffman sounded skeptical. Not necessarily in the murder itself, but possibly in covering it up. He was Pullman's direct supervisor, had access to the same equipment and materials, and was responsible for the road painting schedule the week James disappeared. At the very least, he might know where Pullman went after leaving town. Hoffman agreed to send a patrol car to meet her at Gillespie's address, emphasizing caution. Approach this as a welfare check first. If Gillespie has just gone fishing or something, we don't want to create undue panic. When Ramona arrived at Gillespie's modest ranch house, Officer Patel was already waiting in his patrol car. Together, they approached the front door and knocked. No response. The driveway was empty, the blinds drawn. His car's not here, Patel observed. Maybe he really is just out sick. Let's check around back, Ramona suggested. See if there are any signs of hasty departure. The backyard was well maintained but unremarkable. A small patio, a shed, and a vegetable garden. Ramona peered through the sliding glass door into the kitchen. Nothing seemed out of place, but a coffee mug sat on the counter, suggesting Gillespie had been there recently. I'm going to try calling his sister, Ramona decided, pulling out her phone. See if she's heard from him. The conversation with Frank. Gillespie's sister, Martha Larson, was brief but illuminating. She hadn't heard from her brother in several days, unusual, as they typically spoke at least twice a week. More interestingly, she mentioned that Frank had a cabin near Clearwater Lake about 50 miles northeast of Pinewood Springs. He goes there when he needs to think, Martha explained. It's pretty remote. No cell service, no neighbors, just Frank and the fish. Do you have the address? Ramona asked. It's not really an address, more like a location. I can give you directions, though. After hanging up, Ramona relayed the information to Chief Hoffman, who authorized her to drive to the cabin, accompanied by Officer Patel. But remember, this is still just a follow-up interview at this point, Hoffman cautioned. We don't have evidence that Gillespie committed any crime. The drive to Clearwater Lake took nearly an hour, the last 15 minutes on an unpaved Forest Service road that tested the suspension of Ramona's department-issued sedan. The cabin itself was tucked among towering pines, a rustic A-frame structure, with a small dock extending into the lake's pristine waters. A truck was parked in the clearing beside the cabin. Not Gillespie's vehicle according to the registration number Ramona had checked, but an older model pickup with Arizona plates. Call for backup, Ramona instructed Patel, drawing her service weapon. And stay alert. We don't know what we're walking into. They approached the cabin cautiously, positioning themselves on either side of the door. Ramona knocked firmly. Frank? Gillespie? Pinewood Springs Police. We need to speak with you. Silence. She knocked again, louder. Mr. Gillespie, If you're in there, please identify yourself." The crack of a twig breaking in the woods behind them caused both officers to whirl around, weapons raised. A man stood at the tree line, fishing rod in hand, looking startled to find armed police at his cabin. "Frank Gillespie," Ramona called, out, keeping her weapon trained on him. The man nodded slowly. "What's this about?" His voice was steady, but his eyes darted nervously between the officers and the cabin behind them. "We need to ask you some questions about Edward Pullman," Ramona explained, not lowering her weapon. "Is there anyone else here with you?" Before Gillespie could answer, the cabin door creaked open slightly. Ramona spun, repositioning to cover both potential threats. "Whose truck is that, Mr. Gillespie?" she demanded. "The one with Arizona plates." Gillespie's shoulders slumped in defeat. "It's Ed's. He's inside." The next few minutes unfolded with the controlled chaos of a high-risk arrest. Backup arrived, 2 state troopers who had been patrolling nearby. Edward Pullman was ordered out of the cabin at gunpoint, emerging with his hands raised, his unremarkable appearance belying the horror of his actions 12 years earlier. Both men were taken into custody and transported separately back to Pinewood Springs. In the aftermath, as crime scene technicians processed the cabin for evidence, Ramona stood on the dock, gazing out at the peaceful lake that had nearly become a perfect hideaway for a child killer. Her phone rang, the lab calling with news that would cement the case against Pullman. The partial fingerprints on the toy fire engine were a match. They had their man. The interrogation rooms at the Pinewood Springs Police Department were deliberately austere. Blank walls, uncomfortable chairs, the subtle psychological pressure of isolation. Ramona decided to speak with Frank Gillespie. First, suspecting he'd be more likely to cooperate once he understood the gravity of his situation. "Let me be clear about what we know," she began, laying out photographs on the metal table. James Torres was killed by a blow to the head, likely with a shovel. His body was buried on the Maple Drive lot, a location where Edward Pullman had been assigned to work just days before the murder. Herbicide consistent with what the Parks Department used was spread over the grave to hide disturbed earth. Pullman's fingerprints were found on a toy recovered from the burial site. Gillespie stared at the photos, his face ashen. "What we don't know yet," Ramona continued, "is exactly what role you played. But harboring a fugitive is a serious offense, Frank. You could be looking at significant prison time. Your best option right now is complete honesty." The story spilled out haltingly at first, then in a torrent of guilt-ridden confession. Gillespie hadn't helped kill James. He had been genuinely working elsewhere that day. But he had helped cover it up in the aftermath. "Ed showed up at my house that night, frantic, covered in dirt," Gillespie recounted, his voice hollow. "He said there'd been an accident at the Maple Drive lot. A kid had seen him dumping some personal trash there, stuff he didn't want going to the regular landfill, and started asking questions. Ed claimed he just wanted to scare the boy away, swung a shovel to frighten him but hit him instead. Said it was an accident." "And you believed that?" Ramona asked skeptically. Gillespie's eyes dropped to the table. "I didn't know what to believe. Ed was my friend. We'd worked together for years. He seemed genuinely distraught." "So you helped him cover up a child's death. I told him to report it, that it would be better to come clean. But he was terrified of going to prison. He begged me to help make the evidence disappear." Gillespie's voice cracked. "I knew the case would come across my desk eventually. Any maintenance needs in the park system did. So when the search for the missing boy started, I made sure areas like the Maple Drive lot weren't prioritized." "And you provided Pullman with the herbicide to disguise the gravesite?" Ramona pressed. Gillespie nodded miserably. "I didn't think anyone would ever find the body. That lot was scheduled for environmental remediation, which would have meant excavating and removing the top several feet of soil because of old chemical dumping there. But then the city changed plans, sold the property instead when the remediation proved too expensive." Where has Pullman been all these years? Moving around. He went to Arizona initially, then Nevada, Utah, Idaho. Different names, different jobs, but always the same pattern, working somewhere with access to children. Gillespie seemed to crumple in on himself as he spoke. He'd call every few months, just to check if the case was still active. When I heard you asking questions, yesterday, connecting him to both locations, I warned him. I told him to meet me at the cabin so we could figure out what to do. What was the plan? Run again? Keep hiding the truth while James's parents suffered? Gillespie had no answer for that, just shameful silence. The interrogation of Edward Pullman proved more challenging. Unlike Gillespie, he showed no remorse, no recognition of the gravity of his actions. He denied everything, claimed he'd been framed, insisted the fingerprints must have been planted. But as the evidence mounted, the forensic analysis of soil and paint samples, the testimony from his former supervisor, the reconstruction of his movements that day, his denials became increasingly hollow. It wasn't until Ramona mentioned the items found during a search of his truck, photographs of children playing in parks, newspaper clippings about missing children cases across multiple states, that Pullman's facade finally cracked. "Do you know how easy it is?" he asked, a disturbing gleam in his eyes. "Kids are so trusting. All you have to do is offer them something shiny, something interesting. Show them a wounded animal in the woods. Tell them you found their lost toy. They'll follow you anywhere." Ramona maintained her professional composure, though her stomach churned at his matter-of-fact description. "Is that what you did with James Torres? Lured him away with a story about a wounded animal?" Pullman's smile was the most chilling thing Ramona had seen in years of working homicide cases. "Smart kid, that one. Asked too many questions. Saw things he shouldn't have seen." "What did he see, Edward? What were you hiding at that lot?" "Evidence," Pullman replied cryptically. "From Nevada. A loose end I needed to clean up before moving on." The implications were clear and deeply disturbing. James Torres hadn't been Pullman's first victim, merely the one that had forced him to flee Pinewood Springs. How many others had there been over the years? How many families were still wondering what had happened to their missing children? In the days that followed, a grim pattern emerged as investigators in multiple states connected Edward Pullman to at least 3 other child disappearances dating back to 2008. Each case involved a young boy who vanished from a park or playground. In 2 cases, remains had been found but never identified. In the third, the child was still listed as missing. For the Torres family, the arrest and subsequent confession brought a complex mixture of closure and renewed grief. The funeral for James was held 6 days after the discovery of his remains, attended by hundreds of Pinewood Springs residents who had never forgotten the little boy who disappeared from their midst. Daniel and Maria stood side by side at the graveside, their hands occasionally brushing, not quite holding, but sharing in the weight of the moment. Ramona watched from a respectful distance, knowing that while her work had helped bring them answers, nothing could fill the void left by 12 years of absence. After the service, Daniel approached her with red-rimmed eyes, but a steady voice. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up." "I was just doing my job," Ramona replied. "No," Daniel shook his head. "Many people did their jobs over the years. You did more. You saw connections others missed. You followed your instincts." "I had motivation," Ramona admitted. "This case resonated. With me personally." Daniel nodded in understanding. "Your brother. The chief mentioned that you had lost a brother in similar circumstances. Not similar enough, as it turns out. My brother ran away, got involved with drugs. We found him eventually, but too late." Ramona hadn't spoken of this publicly, had kept her personal history separate from her professional life. But standing here, with a father who had finally found his own lost child, The walls between professional and personal seemed artificial. I guess I've been looking for him ever since, in every missing persons case that crosses my desk. And now you've found James. Given us the answers we needed. Daniel glanced back at the fresh grave, at Maria kneeling beside it. I don't know. What happens next? How to live without both the hope and the uncertainty that have defined the last 12 years. But at least now we can try. 1 month later, Edward Pullman stood in a courtroom and pleaded guilty to the murder of James Torres. In exchange for avoiding the death penalty, he provided information that helped recover the remains of 2 other victims in Nevada and Utah. Frank Gillespie, charged as an accessory after the fact, received a 15-year sentence for his role in concealing the crime. For Ramona, the case represented both an end and a beginning. The successful resolution brought professional recognition, a commendation from the department, offers to speak at law enforcement conferences about cold case methodology, but more importantly, it reinforced her commitment to the victims who couldn't speak for themselves, to the families left behind with gaping holes in their lives. On her desk sat a new case file. Another child gone missing, this one more recently. Another family desperate for answers. Another puzzle waiting to be solved. She opened the file and began to read. 3 years later, a small gathering assembled at Pinewood Springs Elementary School for the dedication of a new playground. The James Torres Memorial Play Area. The construction of the community center at the Maple Drive lot had been abandoned. The land instead transformed into a park with state-of-the-art play equipment, sports fields, and a memorial garden. Daniel Torres, now the school's guidance counselor, stood at the podium, his face showing the lines of grief, but also the softness that comes with healing. This playground represents our community's commitment to protecting our children, he said, looking out at the assembled families, to creating safe spaces where they can play, grow, and explore without fear. James would have loved this place. Especially the swings. His voice caught momentarily before he continued. He always loved the swings. In the back row, Ramona Walsh watched as Daniel cut the ribbon, officially opening the playground to the excited children waiting impatiently behind a symbolic barrier. As the children rushed forward, filling the space with laughter and movement, she felt a sense of completion, of something broken, made if not whole, then at least purposeful in its brokenness. Some wounds never fully heal, she knew. But with time, with justice, and with the determination to create meaning from tragedy, even the deepest scars could become bearable. Not erased, but incorporated into the landscape of a life continued. Daniel caught her eye across the playground and raised a hand in greeting. Ramona returned the gesture, then turned to leave. There were other cases waiting, other families seeking answers, other children who deserved the justice that had finally come for James Torres. Thank you for joining us for this heart-wrenching but ultimately hopeful story of persistence, justice, and healing. If you appreciated this journey and want to hear more stories that shine a light on the resilience of the human spirit and the pursuit of truth, please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Each week, we bring you compelling narratives that explore the depths of human experience and the triumph of determination over darkness. Your subscription helps us continue sharing these important stories that might otherwise remain untold. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case and let us know what kind of stories you'd like to hear in the future. Remember that, by listening and sharing these accounts, you're helping keep the memory of victims alive and supporting the ongoing pursuit of justice. Thank you for being part of our community. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay compassionate, and remember that even in the darkest circumstances, light can eventually prevail.